Steve Harvey felt the cold metal of the handcuffs click around his wrists as Detective Patricia Coleman read him his rights on the steps of the Chicago federal courthouse, completely unaware that America's beloved Family Feud host had been secretly working for the past 28 months to expose the largest Social Security fraud scheme in U.S. history. A criminal conspiracy that had stolen over $847 million from elderly Americans who had worked their entire lives believing their retirement savings were secure. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as photographers captured every moment of what appeared to be the downfall of one of America's most trusted television personalities. But what Detective Coleman and the assembled media didn't know was that every suspicious financial transaction she had traced back to Harvey was actually part of the most sophisticated private investigation ever conducted into federal pension fraud, an investigation that would ultimately save the retirement security of over 2.3 million American seniors. "Mr. Harvey," Detective Coleman announced with the authority of someone who believed she was protecting America's elderly population from celebrity exploitation, "you're under arrest for operating a fraudulent pension investment scheme, conspiracy to defraud senior citizens of their retirement savings, and wire fraud involving the systematic theft of Social Security benefits from vulnerable elderly Americans across 17 states. The crowd of reporters pressed closer as Harvey maintained his composure, his famous smile replaced by a look of quiet determination that those who knew him well would recognize as the expression he wore when facing life's most serious challenges. The charges against Harvey were devastating in their scope and apparently supported by mountains of evidence. According to the federal indictment that Detective Coleman had spent 19 months building, Harvey had been operating a sophisticated Ponzi scheme disguised as a retirement investment program, using his television fame to convince elderly fans to invest their life savings in what he claimed were guaranteed government-backed pension supplements. The evidence appeared overwhelming. Financial records showing $73.4 million in suspicious transactions, testimony from alleged victims claiming they had lost their entire retirement savings, and expert analysis suggesting that Harvey had been systematically targeting the most vulnerable segment of the American population. But the real story had begun 2 years and 4 months earlier, on a quiet Sunday afternoon when Harvey received a phone call that would fundamentally change his understanding of how America's retirement system was being systematically exploited by criminals who understood that elderly Americans represented the most trusting and financially vulnerable targets in the country. The call came from Dorothy Washington, a 73-year-old retired school teacher from Detroit whose Social Security benefits had mysteriously stopped arriving 3 months earlier, leaving her unable to afford her heart medication and facing eviction from the apartment she had called home for 27 years. Before we reveal how Steve Harvey's investigation exposes this massive Social Security scam, hit that subscribe button and notification bell. Because what happens next will shock you about how criminals are stealing from our seniors, and we've got more incredible investigations coming your way. For most celebrities, such a call would have been forwarded to a charitable foundation or government agency and forgotten. But Harvey had built his career on connecting with ordinary Americans, and Dorothy's story of bureaucratic indifference and systematic theft struck at everything he believed about protecting society's most vulnerable members. According to statistics from the Social Security Administration's Office of Inspector General, fraudulent schemes targeting Social Security benefits affect approximately 1.2 million Americans annually, with seniors over 65 representing 78% of all victims due to their trust in authority figures and limited understanding of digital security protocols. Harvey's investigation began with resources that reflected both his financial success and his deep personal commitment to protecting elderly Americans who reminded him of his own parents and grandparents. He hired Sentinel Financial Investigations, a specialized firm that focused exclusively on retirement fraud and elder financial abuse. The firm's director, former Social Security Administration investigator Michael Torres, had spent 21 years tracking benefit fraud and understood exactly how sophisticated criminal organizations exploited weaknesses in federal retirement systems to steal from seniors who had worked their entire lives believing their government would protect their savings. What Torres discovered in his preliminary investigation exceeded even Harvey's worst fears about the vulnerability of America's elderly population. The scheme wasn't just targeting individual seniors through random phone calls or internet scams. It was a systematic infiltration of the Social Security Administration itself, involving corrupt federal employees who were selling access to personal information, benefit records, and even the ability to redirect payments to accounts controlled by criminal organizations. According to analysis by the Government Accountability Office, insider threats represent the fastest-growing category of federal benefit fraud, with criminal networks paying corrupt employees to provide access to databases containing the personal information of millions of American seniors. The financial complexity of the Social Security fraud scheme was staggering beyond comprehension. Torres's team discovered that the criminal organization had generated over $847 million in stolen benefits over the past 4 years, using a combination of identity theft, benefit redirection, and systematic manipulation of federal databases to steal payments from seniors who often didn't realize their benefits had been compromised until they faced financial emergencies. The scheme involved 47 corrupt federal employees across 12 states, 23 banks that had been either compromised or completely fabricated to receive stolen payments, and a network of identity brokers who specialized in acquiring the personal information of elderly Americans. But what made this fraud scheme particularly heartbreaking was its systematic targeting of seniors who were already struggling with fixed incomes, health problems, and social isolation. According to research by the AARP Fraud Watch Network, criminals specifically target elderly Americans because they represent what experts call a perfect storm of vulnerability. They have accumulated savings worth stealing. They trust authority figures who contact them claiming to represent government agencies, and they often lack family members or social support systems who might recognize signs of financial exploitation before irreversible damage occurs. The psychological profile that emerged of the fraud network's leadership was deeply disturbing to anyone who understood the moral implications of stealing from society's most vulnerable members. According to studies by the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, criminals who specialize in elder fraud often justify their actions through psychological mechanisms that allow them to view elderly victims as somehow deserving of exploitation, or by convincing themselves that their victims won't miss money that represents a lifetime of hard work and careful saving. Working with Torres's team, Harvey began documenting the fraud network using methods that combined his natural ability to connect with people and his substantial financial resources to fund an investigation that traditional law enforcement agencies couldn't match. He personally called over 400 elderly Americans who had been identified as potential victims, spending hours listening to their stories, understanding their fears, and carefully documenting the specific techniques that criminals were using to exploit their trust and steal their retirement security. The breakthrough in Harvey's investigation came when Torres's team identified Sandra Martinez, a 12-year Social Security Administration employee who had been recruited by the fraud network, but was clearly struggling with the moral implications of her participation in stealing from elderly Americans. Martinez fit the profile of what federal investigators call a reluctant insider, someone who becomes involved in fraud through financial pressure or manipulation but maintains enough moral awareness to potentially become a whistleblower if approached correctly and offered appropriate protection. According to research by the Merit Systems Protection Board, federal employees who become involved in benefit fraud often do so because of personal financial crises, family emergencies, or systematic pressure from criminal organizations that identify and exploit vulnerable employees. Harvey's team spent 6 months carefully approaching Martinez, using techniques developed by federal investigators for recruiting informants within criminal organizations while ensuring her safety and legal protection throughout the process. It took nearly 8 months of patient cultivation, but Martinez finally agreed to provide inside information about the fraud network's operations within the Social Security Administration. What she revealed was a systematic betrayal of public trust that extended far beyond simple theft. It was a coordinated effort to exploit the federal benefit system that millions of American seniors depended on for their basic survival, turning the very institution designed to protect elderly Americans into a weapon for their financial destruction. The evidence Martinez provided was comprehensive and heartbreaking in its implications for America's elderly population. Audio recordings of fraud coordinators discussing which seniors to target based on their social isolation and cognitive vulnerability. Financial records showing how stolen benefits were distributed among corrupt federal employees and criminal organizations, and detailed documentation of how the network systematically identified elderly Americans who were least likely to recognize they were being victimized until their savings were completely gone. Working with Martinez as an inside source, Harvey's investigation team began mapping the full scope of the fraud network's operations across multiple states and federal agencies. They discovered that the scheme involved not just Social Security Administration employees, but corrupt workers in Medicare offices, Veterans Affairs departments, and even some private companies that processed federal benefit payments, creating a comprehensive system for stealing from elderly Americans regardless of which government programs they depended on for their survival. According to analysis by the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, coordinated benefit fraud schemes typically require 18 to 36 months to establish full operational control over targeted demographic groups, but this network had been operating for over 6 years. The sophistication of their operations had enabled them to steal from elderly Americans with virtually no detection, systematically targeting seniors who were most likely to trust authority figures and least likely to understand the complex financial mechanisms being used to exploit them. The human impact of the fraud scheme was devastating beyond measure for families across America. Harvey's investigation documented cases of elderly Americans who had lost their homes when Social Security payments suddenly stopped, seniors who couldn't afford essential medications when their benefits were redirected to criminal accounts, and families who watched their grandparents face poverty and desperation after a lifetime of work because criminals had systematically stolen the retirement security they had earned through decades of contributions to federal programs. But Harvey's investigation also revealed how the fraud network had been specifically targeting his own fan base, using his reputation for trustworthiness and moral integrity to identify elderly Americans who might be susceptible to investment schemes that claimed to be endorsed by celebrities they admired. Over the past 18 months, the network had used Harvey's name and image without permission to promote fraudulent retirement investment programs, deliberately exploiting the trust that elderly Americans felt toward him to steal their life savings. The personal targeting of Harvey's reputation was systematic and sophisticated, involving fake websites that claim to offer Steve Harvey's secret retirement strategy, recorded phone calls that used artificial intelligence to simulate Harvey's voice promoting fraudulent investment opportunities, and even fake television advertisements that appeared to show Harvey endorsing pension supplements that were actually fronts for criminal organizations designed to steal from senior citizens. But Harvey's commitment to protecting America's elderly population never wavered, despite the enormous personal risks involved in challenging a criminal organization that had demonstrated its willingness to exploit society's most vulnerable members. He had built his career on values of family, hard work, and protecting those who needed help, and discovering that his own reputation was being used to steal from elderly Americans only strengthened his determination to expose the entire fraud network regardless of the personal cost to his career and reputation. The trap was set when the fraud network decided to eliminate Harvey as a threat to their operations. Criminal organizations had become increasingly concerned about Harvey's investigation and community outreach to elderly Americans, recognizing that his influence and credibility posed an existential threat to their ability to continue exploiting senior citizens. Working with corrupt federal agents and using falsified evidence, they orchestrated a comprehensive federal investigation designed to destroy Harvey's reputation by framing him as the very type of criminal he had been working to expose. What the fraud network didn't realize was that Harvey's investigation team had been monitoring their activities for over 2 years, using surveillance methods that exceeded anything available to traditional law enforcement. They had documented meetings between fraud coordinators and corrupt federal employees, recorded conversations about targeting specific elderly victims, and traced the flow of stolen Social Security benefits through the network's money laundering operations. They had comprehensive evidence of the criminal enterprise and were prepared to present documentation that would expose not just individual crimes but the entire system of corruption that had enabled systematic theft from America's seniors. The fabricated case against Harvey was sophisticated and appeared to be supported by overwhelming evidence of exactly the type of fraud he had been working to expose. Financial records showing suspicious investment transactions, testimony from alleged elderly victims claiming Harvey had stolen their retirement savings, and expert analysis suggesting systematic exploitation of senior citizens all painted a picture of celebrity-enabled elder fraud. The fraud network had spent over a year building the case, convinced that destroying Harvey's reputation would eliminate the greatest threat their criminal enterprise had ever faced. But Harvey's legal team was prepared for the criminal network's attack. Led by former federal prosecutor David Rodriguez, one of the most experienced elder fraud defense attorneys in the country, they had spent months preparing for the moment when the fraud network would try to neutralize Harvey's investigation by destroying his credibility and reputation. They had compiled comprehensive evidence of the real Social Security fraud scheme and were ready to present documentation that would expose the true criminals while vindicating Harvey's efforts to protect America's elderly population. On the morning when Detective Coleman announced Harvey's arrest at a packed press conference outside the federal courthouse, she stood before the assembled media convinced that she was protecting America's seniors from celebrity exploitation, having no idea that she was actually providing cover for the real criminals who had been systematically stealing from elderly Americans for years. The press conference was attended by federal investigators, senior advocates, and community leaders who believed they were witnessing the exposure of elder fraud, not realizing they were watching the climax of the criminals' efforts to silence their most effective opponent. "Ladies and gentlemen," Detective Coleman announced to the crowd of reporters and television cameras, her voice carrying the moral authority of someone who believed she was defending society's most vulnerable members. "Today we've arrested someone who betrayed the trust of America's seniors in the most despicable way possible. Steve Harvey used his fame and the love that elderly Americans felt for him to steal their life savings, exploit their trust, and destroy the retirement security they had worked their entire lives to build. This case proves that we will pursue anyone who preys on our seniors, regardless of their celebrity status or public reputation." But even as Coleman spoke, federal agents from the Social Security Administration's Office of Inspector General were coordinating with Harvey's legal team to prepare for the most dramatic reversal in elder fraud prosecution history. David Rodriguez had been working with federal prosecutors for weeks, providing them with the comprehensive evidence that Harvey's investigation had compiled about the real Social Security fraud network. Evidence that would not only exonerate Harvey but expose the largest systematic theft from elderly Americans in federal history. The reversal came exactly 96 hours later, when federal agents conducted coordinated raids across 12 states, arresting 47 Social Security Administration employees, 23 banking officials, and 18 fraud coordinators who had been operating the real criminal enterprise that Harvey had been working to expose. The evidence that Harvey's investigation had provided was so comprehensive that federal prosecutors were able to build cases against the entire organizational structure of the fraud network, from corrupt federal employees to the criminal masterminds who had orchestrated systematic theft from America's seniors. As the real criminals were led away in handcuffs, Harvey finally spoke publicly about his investigation for the first time. "For over 2 years, I've watched criminals steal from the grandparents and great-grandparents of America," he said in a statement that was broadcast nationwide. "They used my name and reputation to exploit the trust of elderly Americans who worked their whole lives believing their government would protect their retirement. Today, we begin to restore that trust and ensure that seniors can live with dignity and security." The aftermath was swift and comprehensive in its scope of justice for America's elderly population. Within 3 weeks, federal investigations had identified and begun returning stolen benefits to over 89,000 elderly Americans who had been victimized by the fraud network, restored Social Security payments to thousands of seniors who had been living without their earned benefits, and implemented new security measures designed to prevent future exploitation of federal retirement systems. 6 months later, Harvey stood before the Senate Special Committee on Aging as they passed the Senior Security and Benefit Protection Act, comprehensive legislation requiring enhanced security measures for all federal benefit programs and criminal penalties for anyone who uses celebrity endorsements to defraud elderly Americans. Sometimes, he told the assembled senators and senior advocates, protecting the people who built this country requires us to risk everything we've built for ourselves. The investigation ultimately resulted in the conviction of 68 defendants on federal fraud and racketeering charges, with sentences ranging from 15 years to life imprisonment for the criminal masterminds who had orchestrated systematic theft from America's seniors. The recovery and return of $847 million in stolen benefits enabled thousands of elderly Americans to regain their financial security and live with the dignity they had earned through a lifetime of work and contribution to American society. Today, Harvey continues his television career while also serving as a senior advocate and spokesman for federal benefit security programs. His willingness to risk his reputation and career to protect America's elderly population led to the most significant reform of senior benefit security in federal history, ensuring that the retirement savings of millions of Americans are better protected from criminal exploitation. The Steve Harvey Foundation now provides financial literacy education specifically designed for senior citizens, teaching elderly Americans how to recognize and protect themselves from the fraud schemes that target their age group. His investigation proved that protecting America's seniors requires not just government programs, but individual citizens willing to use their resources and influence to defend those who built the country we all benefit from today. Steve Harvey's battle against the Social Security fraud network demonstrated that true patriotism sometimes means challenging the very institutions we're supposed to trust, when those institutions have been corrupted by criminals who prey on the Americans who deserve our protection most. His courage in fighting for seniors' financial security created lasting change that will protect elderly Americans for generations to come.